Good morning. It is now time to resume the hearing session. It forms part of our examination of the South London Waste Plan. I'm Inspector G.J. Fort, and my colleague here is Inspector Stephen Normington. We're appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct this examination and to report to the Council in due course. The format of the hearing is a structured and focused discussion that we shall lead. Just before we begin our discussion of matter 2 this morning, there's a few preliminary matters that we need to go through. So firstly, could I ask the representatives from the boroughs to introduce themselves again, please?
Good morning. My name's Dean James. I'm the Planning Policy Manager at the London Borough of Sutton.
My name's Patrick Witter from Sutton Council.
Good morning. I'm Julia Daw. I'm from London Borough of Croydon and I'm the plan making team leader.
Tara Butler, London Borough of Merton.
Even van der Westhuizen, London Borough of Merton, Planning Officer.
Tom Bryant from the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames, Principal Planning Policy Officer.
Thank you. And would other participants like to introduce themselves, please?
Morning, David Payne, BPP Consulting, representing 777 Demolition and Haulage.
Chris Furness from Suez Recycling Recovery UK.
Mr. Payne, I gather you've got a colleague on the Zoom link this morning. Are they intending to speak at all?
They may chip in, but he's coming tomorrow to cover matter 3 in more detail. So I'm not sure whether he's going to chip in or not, to be honest.
If he is,
I'm happy to introduce myself, sir.
He's online, so.
Sir, yes, this is Alan Potter from BPP Consulting.
Thank you, Mr. Potter. And are you aware of the hands up function on Zoom if you need to capture our attention?
I am. Thank you for the reminder, sir.
Okay, thank you. We're joined today by the Programme Officer, Carmel Edwards, and Carmel is the first point of contact for anyone who with any aspects to do with the hearings or any material. And outside of the hearing sessions, Inspector Normington and I will only engage with participants via Carmel. Mr. van der Westhuizen, could you remind us of the housekeeping arrangements, please?
Okay, with regards to mobile phones, just a reminder to switch them off or keep them on silent mode now. The toilets are downstairs at ground level at the main entrance to the Civic Centre. That's just to the left of the stairs that was leading up to the council chamber. There's a drinking water dispenser near the entrance to the toilets. Please use the alcohol wipes and the hand gel that is available on the table at the entrance to the chamber. There are no fire drills scheduled during the hearing today. If the fire alarm sounds, either intermittently or continuously, please leave the building immediately by the nearest available fire exit without stopping to collect belongings. Staff will direct you to the exits and fire assembly point. If you're unable to use the stairs, a member of staff will assist you. The hearing will reconvene if it's safe to do so, otherwise it will stand adjourned. Please ensure that you've signed the attendance sheet on the table at the entrance to the chamber. Please note that this meeting is being filmed for publication on the Council's YouTube channel. Therefore, if you're participating in this meeting, you're consenting to being recorded and to the use of those recordings for broadcasting. When the inspector invites participants to speak, they need to press the little silver button with an icon of an head at the base of the microphone in front of them. A red light will shine on the microphone, indicating that the microphone is on, and the camera will then focus on the speaker. When the participant has finished speaking, they must press the same button again to switch the microphone off, which will switch the red light off and the camera's focus will draw back. There's an induction loop within the council chamber for people with hearing difficulties.
Thank you. So Inspector Normington and I are tasked with considering the soundness of the plan in accordance with the criteria of the National Planning Policy Framework, and also whether it is legally compliant. The hearings are intended to assist us in that regard. In submitting the plan, the boroughs consider that it is sound, and this is the starting point for the examination. So if you are challenging the soundness of the plan, then you have to explain why and what changes will be necessary to make it sound. We have read and will take into account the hearing statements that have been prepared and also the original representations that were made, and there's no need for these to be substantially repeated. Instead, our aim is that the discussion moves on from those documents and deals with specific questions that we have or areas where further clarification or explanation are required. At times, we may ask for a more general contribution or a summary of your position, and it is also helpful to stick to the matter in hand and refrain from commenting on unrelated matters. If you wish to comment on the matters under discussion today, then please indicate this by turning your nameplate on its side. We may also invite contributions from you on specific points where we think this may assist the examination. If you wish to highlight certain parts of your statement or other documents that form part of the examination, then it will be helpful to me if you can provide the reference. So are there any questions at this stage about the procedural aspects of the hearings? Okay, in that case, we'll move on to matter 2. So in starting our discussion of this matter, could I have the borough's opening view on whether the plan is in general conformity with the London plan, taking into account the effect of any modifications that have been proposed in this respect?
Thank you, sir. The borough's position is that we are in general conformity with the London plan. That includes the modifications that we've proposed within this matter statement. Those arose following some discussions that we held with the Mayor of London and the GLA team over the summer to address their 2 outstanding issues that they had with the plan. About the amount of compensatory provision we would require, and clarifying our position on the waste hierarchy within policy WP3 and WP4. So we have proposed some modifications to address those. We have signed a statement of common ground with the GLA to show our agreement on that matter. So we on those 2 points, we think we are in general conformity with the London plan. I think obviously the nub of the issue was around, for other participants, was around the restrictive approach that we set out in WP3. But we consider that the circumstances in the borough justify that position in terms of the amount of capacity that we've identified and the pressure that we are under to provide industrial land where there's an acute lack of supply. The mayor hasn't raised any further issues with that approach, and as you would have seen, has issued, in his opinion, that the plan is in general conformity with the London plan now, which is within the examination library. So, in summary, we do think we are in general conformity with the London plan.
Thank you, Mr. James. So the South London Waste Plan has a different plan period to the London Plan. So could you expand on the rationale and the approach to that, please?
So the South London Waste Plan proposes a 15-year plan period. So that would be from 2021 to 2036, compared to the London Plan plan period, which is up to 2041. We consider that that is the correct approach for us. Obviously, the NPPF mentions that strategic policy should look ahead for a minimum of 15 years. So we've achieved that by going to 2036. In terms of the apportionment figures, we set out in matter 1 how our figures are called with those set out in the London Plan. So the London Plan goes on for that extra 5-year period. So we've calculated what our figure would be at 2036 by dividing that gap into 3 5-year bands. And as we set out in the statement, if that sequence continues, then we arrive at the London Plan apportionment figure for 2041. But in any event, we think we can meet that within the plan period itself anyway. So we don't think, in our view, there isn't any issue with our plan period being 5 years shorter, sir.
Thank you, Mr. James. I'd like to open the discussion up now to other participants on this matter. So we've heard from Mr. James that there's been a statement of common ground with the mayor, and there's also been a letter which has outlined that in the mayor's opinion that the South London Plan is in conformity, general conformity with the London Plan. So with that in mind, could I ask Mr. Payne initially, what are your general views on this matter?
Our general view was, I think we read the policy initially in a different way. I read it to also imply that you couldn't deliver compensatory capacity for loss of sites within the South London Waste Plan area elsewhere in London, because the way the policy reads, you could read it that way, which means it wouldn't apply the same approach as the London Plan, which allows you to identify compensatory capacity anywhere in London to maintain London's net self-sufficiency. So clarity on that would be helpful. I think on a wider approach to the plan, obviously I'm representing a client who is seeking to remove safeguarding from his site because it's just not viable anymore, and the tonnage throughput has gone down dramatically over the last 10 and particularly the last 5 years. And we feel that release of that site would help deliver the boroughs and the South London Waste Plan, particularly the London Borough of Sutton's aspirations for release of further industrial land. As Mr. James said, there's an acute shortage of such land in Sutton. And of course, the London Plan says that the release of safeguarding should be a plan-led process rather than at the application stage. The tests required to deliver release of safeguarding through an application are very high, as they probably should be. But in some cases, it's very difficult to demonstrate how you deliver the compensatory provision if you are not in control of the land on which that compensatory provision is going to be met. So I'd like to introduce that as a wider point about kind of wider planning aspirations, really, beyond waste, and looking at the interests of our client in terms of releasing. This is an opportunity for the plan to consider whether there's a need to safeguard all of those sites, particularly this site where the operator has no aspiration to continue and is struggling financially because of the massive decline in throughputs. The annual monitoring report, SLWP 16, identifies that the qualifying managed capacity is only around 12,000 tonnes at that site now. So it's just a demonstration, I think, of the way the management has gone down and the throughput's gone down.
Okay, just a follow-up question on that, Mr. Bain. If I take you to policy SI 9 of the London plan. So criterion A of that says that existing waste sites should be safeguarded and retained in waste management use. So would removing a site such as that from safeguarding, as you suggest in terms of your client's site, would that be in general conformity with that element of the London plan?
On the face of it, no, but then the supporting text beneath that, 9.9.2, which I referred to, says any proposed release of current waste sites or those identified in future waste management capacity should be part of a plan-led process rather than done on an ad hoc basis. So that kind of qualifies that statement or the policy in clause A, I think. As I say, to demonstrate the release through a planning application can be difficult. We have done it before, but it is difficult to demonstrate how you deliver the compensatory capacity. And there isn't a lot of guidance on how you do that and what qualifies as sufficient evidence to demonstrate you can deliver that. But it also says it should be through the plan-led process. So obviously we're in the planning process right now. The boroughs identify a large surplus of existing capacity for construction waste particularly, but also household and commercial and industrial. I think that's without the sewers additional 200,000 tonnes as well. So from our view, the plan itself identifies, by safeguarding every site, you identify a very, very large surplus to deliver what's required to deliver the apportionments and the construction demolition waste. Releasing the site would help deliver those wider objectives for release of commercial and industrial land, rather than a waste use which is running down and is not viable anymore.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Mr. Furness, any general comments on this matter?
I think in general, we support the overall the plan. It's clearly demonstrated that it meets the apportionment over the lifetime of the plan, and part of our strategy to relocate from the site Benedict Wharf in Mitcham to Beddington Lane, is a main part of that overall strategy. The point that I would make particular to this is, although we have no other plans in place that would require us to relocate to a site within South London, I do think it is a restrictive policy that prevents the relocation of waste uses that may be lost elsewhere in London into South London waste plan area. There are several areas in the London plan where it is clear that the policy is meant to be, I read that the policy is meant to be flexible. And we've worked on this area for a long time, actually, with the GLA. We worked on a previous site different to this relocation in London Borough of Merton and London Borough of Sutton, where we had a very similar situation. We wanted to release a site from one waste plan and relocate the apportionment to another waste plan area. Unfortunately, because there is no way to tie between those two waste plans who benefits from the apportionment, that was something that we weren't able to do. So the overall wider benefit for London was lost. And when we were when the new London plan was being developed, that is something that we were clear on, that in the future, the plan should have a greater degree of flexibility to allow loss of a site here to be re-provided by an available site in a different waste plan area. And the market really directs you in that way, because in London, there aren't a great deal of sites. So if to use this example here, 777 have discovered that their current site isn't viable for them, and it's not working for them for whatever reason, and they need to find another site somewhere else that might work for them. We've just heard there's a massive shortage of industrial land. Well, that available site might not be available within the South London Waste Plan area, but it might be available in North London. It might be available in West London. And the freedom to have that movement, it is required by the industry. You know, that if there is no other site here, then you can't provide the compensation here. So that is really the only issue that I have in this area. That I do think when you read some of the wording within the London plan, so 100% of London's waste should be managed within London. Again, it talks about London as a whole. Waste 9.8.3 in the London plan, waste contracts do not recognise administrative boundaries and waste flows across boundaries. Therefore, sufficient sites should be identified within London to deal with the equivalent of 100% of the waste apportioned to the boroughs. 9.8.9, waste planning authorities are encouraged to identify suitable additional capacity for waste. 9.8.10, waste plans should be responsive to strategic opportunities, that in cases where sites can't be provided and suitable capacity is found in another borough, the receiving borough or joint waste planning group is encouraged to take on the apportionment and include it as part of the development plan. And the London plan is clear that, you know, London is only managing, or was at the time of publishing, to deal with 60% of its own waste. So it's missing the target. There is an issue there, and I think the flexibility should be afforded to enable industry to do that. Really, that was in summary my point. I think looking at the way, I understand there's a shortage of industrial land, but I think we are getting to the stage in industry where perhaps having a dividing line between a waste facility and an industrial facility is the line is blurring. A lot of our facilities now, you would drive past them, you would just consider them to be an industrial facility. Where we are working rapidly towards a circular economy, recovering materials and creating products rather than dealing historically, like plans have, with waste movements from A to B for disposal. So we are part of that industrial land market, and there's a sort of a strange line there in suggesting that you are protecting industrial land by preventing waste when it is part of the same market area. That was all. Thank you.
Thank you. I've seen that you've got your hand up, Mr. Potter. I'll come to you in a minute. I just had a follow-up, Mr. Furness. In terms of any modifications to the plan that might be required to make it sound, have you got any views on that at this juncture?
I think that the policy could reference that there is no need at the moment for new waste sites, that that the South London Waste Plan area has met its apportionment. However, that where there were environmental or wider benefits to an application, that applications for waste development would be supported. So it provides just a small extra loop. There are other protections in the plan for high levels of design amenity, jobs, and likewise in the London plan there are very similar triggers that that are expected of a waste application. So I think that would still provide the ability for the boroughs to say, if they did not believe that those benefits were in place, they could refuse that application to protect industrial land supply.
Just a question, Mr. James, just that there's perhaps two issues here, I think, that seem to be coming forward. One is policy WP3, section D, which is quite precise in terms of where compensation capacity should be. The second is a matter that we're probably going to strain tomorrow also, but I will touch upon that. I think my question on the first one is that and it's our question really, is that policy overly restrictive? For example, if there is issues regarding industrial land supply, and therefore if a site is looking to relocate because there might be other planning advantages to relocating, and there isn't another site within the plan area, but there might be another site very close to the plan area that can manage that waste, then as a plan currently reads, you're kind of trapped. And therefore, what would the advantage be of an hierarchical approach where you perhaps look at, first of all, plan area, and if it can be proven there aren't any sites for London has a very competitive market for many things, but industrial land in particular, it's been alluded to. If you can't find anything in the plan area, why couldn't you, having demonstrated there's nothing available, to retain the capacity that Mr. Furness mentioned there, look at something outside of the plan area, but nonetheless within London and therefore still compliant? That's my first question. The second question, which is perhaps something for tomorrow also, that Mr. Payne raised this issue about other aspects of conformity with Merton's local plan in terms of scarcity of employment land. And there's kind of two questions arise from that. The first one, therefore, is how does this plan fit? And when we are talking conformity, but not necessarily the London plan, with the other tensions regarding supply of employment land. In other words, if we have overcapacity, what would be the harm of resolving other tensions in another plan where there is undercapacity of employment land supply? And that's perhaps where Mr. Payne's coming from in that sense. But secondly, and I appreciate this is probably more of an issue for tomorrow, but it's something you might want to think about overnight. What is so special that says that 777 demolition site could be made available for employment land that would then perhaps open the floodgates for everybody else to come and say, well, thank you very much, I'll have mine unsafeguarded too. And I will contribute to employment land supply because I get a better land value and all the other things that go with development land economics on that. So there's a couple of questions there I think that's arisen from that kind of discussion. One is about WP3D, whether it is over restrictive. And then secondly, there's something, and you might want to defer that till tomorrow, and I can understand that because we're straight into tomorrow's discussion. But there is this tension that's been alluded to there about, on the one hand, we've got overcapacity of waste. On the other hand, we've got undercapacity of employment land. And therefore, what's wrong in addressing that balance in this plan to achieve perhaps conformity with other aspirations of the development plan framework? So we'll perhaps deal with my first question, W3P3D, and then, as I say, if you want to park some of my second parts until tomorrow, because that's when we get into the nub of the discussion that Mr. Payne raised, I think. But WP3D, first of all, how do you see that restrictive nature of that policy?
Thank you, sir. The original intention of the policy, I think Mr. Payne's right, it was principally aimed at restricting sites from outside the plan area relocating within because of our capacity and because of the constraint on industrial land. It wasn't necessarily aimed at preventing sites moving the other way. That wasn't the principal purpose, although there is a slight concern about if we were to lose a site from South London, we lose that capacity, but that site doesn't take the apportionment with it. There may be pressure in the future about us meeting our own apportionment if we have lost a waste site. But the principal aim of the policy was to prevent or to restrict more sites coming to South London and exacerbating those issues that we've set out within the plan and our supporting evidence and statements. So, I mean, as I say, the issue is, I mean, we could propose a modification. I know there is, some, as I say, some slight concern about sites going but not taking their apportionment and where that would leave us. At the moment, we're okay. We think we've got a decent surplus, and I don't think that that's being contested by anybody. But it's a case of where would we be in the future if we do lose sites from the plan area. On the second point, I can
Before we
yes,
leave that first point, then as I read the policy, and I think Mr. Payne has read it, you can interpret the policy two ways, depending which argument you want to make. So there's perhaps an issue to consider there. The second point, perhaps as well, is the and I'm obviously aware of what's happening with other waste plans in London that I'm involved with, where there might not be the same capacity issues and surplus that you have. So therefore, if you have a surplus within the plan area and thinking about conformity and cross-boundary movements across London with waste, what is wrong with another site, another operator in, say, North London relocating to South London because you've got capacity? What's wrong with that approach? It's me being a devil's advocate. I'm not saying you're right or you're wrong, but it's me trying to understand how that policy works, because you can read it two ways. You interpret it as being it's to stop things coming into London, into the plan area, but you could say, well, why? You've got plenty of capacity to deal with this. And then the other side of the coin is that you can read that policy by saying, actually, you can't find another site outside of London, South London. So it's just understanding how you would address those kind of tensions if you were to suggest some change to the plan.
I think in terms of obviously, say, for example, North London relocating a site within the waste plan area of South London, again, it comes back to this issue about the amount of capacity that we've got. We've got a good surplus at the moment, but not necessarily always going to be the case. And then there's the perception of us having more waste sites than we currently have, which is certainly a concern amongst our residents and communities. And again, the pressure for industrial land. If we've got more sites relocating to South London, then we're going to have less industrial land for us to try and meet industrial need in the future. I mean, this has been a particular issue in the Sutton local plan in trying to meet employment need, whereby we've tried to demonstrate that could be done through intensification of existing sites alone. But some of those sites included waste sites where we were specifically told to remove them from those calculations, and we ended up de-designating metropolitan open land to meet our employment needs. So we don't want to be in that position in the future. If there are more sites coming in, there'll be less sites for us to potentially meet industrial need in the future, which sort of links into the second question you made specifically about Mr. Payne's site and whether or not that could be released to support our industrial supply issues. But as I say, it wasn't necessarily about preventing sites leaving. There is a concern about the apportionment. It was more about us having more sites within the plan area than we currently have.
Just on that point then, before I move on to the second point and just touch upon it. Yeah. I think you're about to suggest we could look at something, because we still have this dilemma, as I think, there is this flexibility of interpretation that's not quite clear in the policy itself, and looking at the supporting text, the supporting text is not necessarily clear either in giving me any kind of explanation as to what's the policy mean then, and how do we apply it for opportunity to move out of the plan area, an opportunity to come into the plan area. And it doesn't seem to address that particular point. So if you were to think about that, how do you think it could be explained better, your position? How do you think you could address the concerns that's been raised and this perhaps ambiguity in terms of policy interpretation?
I mean, we can certainly think about that. We would still, I think, want to maintain our position at the moment that we wouldn't want any additional sites moving within to the plan area, but the policy could be clarified that wouldn't prevent sites going the other way, which would introduce some clarity and a greater degree of flexibility than there is at the moment. But we would want to maintain our position at the moment about additional sites relocating to within the plan area, which is sort of one of our core positions, really. And so it's something we've discussed with the mayor, and the mayor's obviously not raised any further objections to that in his letter of conformity. So I think we could think about some changes to make that position clear about sites going the other way, as well as obviously clarifying that in supporting text too.
We're about to move on to the second point, and I'd just caveat that with the fact that obviously we've got more detailed discussion on that tomorrow. So it's not trying to replicate tomorrow's discussion today, but you were just about to just touch upon that point.
Yes, in terms of the 777 site, at the point of submission, the site was showing significantly more capacity than it does now. We don't contest that the throughput has reduced, and we show a reduced throughput in our updated Appendix 2, which has come down from, I think it was approximately 50,000. It's down to 12,000 now, as Mr. Payne said. So it's the capacity that site contributes is less than the surplus that we're showing at the moment. I think maybe I'll stop. I know we're going to have a discussion tomorrow about capacity and how much we have and things around that. But so maybe I should stop there. But I accept that site has significantly less capacity than we showed at the draft Reg 19 stage, and that has come down.
That's fair enough, because I understand the reason we don't want to open tomorrow's debate up today. But I think the thing that we'd like to just perhaps understand as well, then, because it's been raised by Mr. Payne, is a relationship between industrial land supply and safeguarding sites that might have a decreasing waste management opportunity on them. And now that kind of balance could be addressed, or needs to be addressed, or maybe doesn't need to be addressed. But I think it's perhaps alerting the flag that we'll probably touch upon this issue again tomorrow. Less about the conformity of the London plan, perhaps more about conformity with other development plans in the plan area.
Okay, there's one point I want to follow up on there, Mr. James, from and then I'll bring Mr. Potter into the discussion. But in terms of the compensatory capacity, so you said the core position was that you don't wish to take new sites from needs arising in other London boroughs, but what about a situation where intensification of a site within the South London area could provide capacity for needs of another borough? Have you got any views on that?
I think it's maybe something we could consider if that's not taking effectively a fresh site. It's an existing waste site that's just intensifying its throughput. I can see your point, because we wouldn't be losing any industrial land, which is the principal concern here. I think maybe that's something I would need to discuss with my colleagues, if that's acceptable, sir, before I give a definitive answer on that.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Mr. James. So if I could bring Mr. Potter in, please.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to actually reflect our agreement with the position that Mr. Furness had set out with regard to the need for flexibility. And it struck me, looking at the proposed modifications that have been introduced in response to the GLA's concerns, perhaps the plan's gone the other way in terms of being overly restrictive. And just by way of example, when you're looking at the proposed modification for policy WP4, and it's suggesting that the only suitable locations for any compensatory provision are either existing safeguarded sites or sites within sills or locally significant industrial locations. And it just struck me that reading that was extremely limiting. There could be possible what you might be called windfall sites or locations outside of those areas that may be suitable for a waste facility. And so it struck me that was perhaps overly limiting, and appreciate that question being put to the boroughs.
And Mr. Potter, what modifications would you propose to address your concerns in that regard?
Well, we'd need to have a acknowledgement in that clause, if indeed that is the clause that will be used for determining any kind of future application, to allow for the possibility that sites that are outside sills or locally significant industrial locations may be suitable, and perhaps really picking up with your colleague, Mr. Normington's idea that there should be a more sequential approach. So, you should look at current sites, and you should look at sills, and locally significant industrial locations, in the first instance, but then there should still be scope to develop a site outside of those areas if relevant criteria, which I guess principally would be dictated by development management policies in the plan, were could be met. And there might be very good reasons for that. If, for example, you had a small energy from waste facility that was looking to provide district heating to housing, that might be a case where actually having a facility outside of those particular industrial areas might be desirable. I'm thinking here perhaps more about a small kind of biomass, waste-fired biomass facility, rather than a sort of mainstream waste processing, just as an example.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Potter. And Mr. Payne.
Yeah, I was just going to come back on a point Mr. Normanton made about, I think it was, if you consider site S1, the 777 site, as being an exception, and will other sites then come forward, I think that again is the point of the plan making process, and the delivery report, the deliverability report, sorry, E8, shows how every operator was approached and whether they supported safeguarding or not. And so that exercise has kind of been gone through as part of the plan making process. And that's their opportunity to flag concerns about safeguarding being applied to their sites. So I think, again, it just supports my point about the plan making process is that it's the opportunity to review this rather than just apply a blanket safeguarding to everything. Even though I do agree the London plan, the first clause does say that, but there's got to be some flexibility in that, particularly if you're looking at the changes in the market, the changes in the situation that's actually occurring on the ground with these guys for various reasons, and also aspirations to deliver other benefits. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. James, have you got any general responses to what we've heard from others this morning?
Just one response. So in terms of Mr. Potter's comments about the location of sites, I think we do direct them to existing sites and then or strategic industrial areas or locally significant industrial locations, which is consistent with the London plan, which in London Plan Policy SI 8, I think the only suitable location that's mentioned in London Plan that we omit was with regards to safeguarded wharfs, but that was just because there aren't any within the plan area. So I think we're comfortable with what we're setting out in terms of where waste sites should be directed, new waste sites that are coming forward as part of compensatory provision or otherwise. I think we're happy with what we set out in that policy.
Can I just ask, it's me pushing again, just to think about some of these issues that Mr. Potter's raised and Mr. Payne's raised, and it's this tension, I think, that's crossing my mind regarding need for employment land and the use of employment land for waste development. And whilst the situation now seems to be that there seems to be some balance in that, notwithstanding that there might be sites that we'll discuss tomorrow, but that balance might not always be the balance in the future. And therefore, as a policy is currently worded, if there wasn't available employment land because of seriously competing uses and a defined perhaps need, the ability to relocate might be compromised. And it's back to this sequential approach that it's kind of, well, if the opportunity isn't there because of the extremely high competitive nature of demand for land in London, where does the plan go? It's kind of me thinking, so what would be wrong with that sequential approach if all the hoops and hurdles to try and prove that we've done our best to prove employment land, but there just isn't any, but there is a need to maintain the waste capacity. It's kind of me saying, so what's wrong with that approach? Not suggesting you should, but you've said we're comfortable with the policy, and it's me pushing you a bit further saying, well, there is a scenario here that could happen. So how can the plan respond to that scenario then, if we're stuck with that approach? I just welcome your views on that.
Yes, I see the point that you're making, sir. Again, I think obviously it comes back to our position of trying to maintain sufficient capacity to meet that apportionment, as well as trying to balance that against employment need. And I think, going back to what I said earlier, maybe there are some changes that we could consider to the policy, which I can discuss with colleagues, that would give a greater degree of flexibility in terms of sites leaving the waste plan area. We can consider the sequential approach that we've been discussing, and try and think about there are any other unforeseen circumstances or scenarios that could arise from such an approach. So I think maybe that's something we can give some thought to during the lunch break, and I'm sure will come up again tomorrow as well, if that's acceptable.
I think it's obviously you don't want to be thinking about this on the hoof. You need to be carefully considering it, but it's whether or not you think there are any interpretation or modifications to the policy that might address some of the concerns that's been raised. Because I think the concerns have been well founded in that sense, and I think we all recognise those concerns. It's just ensuring that does a plan that's currently written thwart opportunity to the point of being disadvantageous to waste management, or does it provide that flexibility to ensure that that need to maintain waste management capacity and ability is reflected in its policies and its supporting text? So I think perhaps it's something we're going to get back to, I'm sure, tomorrow. So lunchtime's probably a little bit too early, I think, Mr. James, because it's these kind of things often have a knock-on effect. So rather than us saying, I think, yes, come back this afternoon with a revision, that's entirely your choice. But I think it's something that needs to be considered, is kind of my view, because it could have other repercussions. But equally, there's something in there about where does this sit with industrial land supply as well. If there is that tension there, there's something that we just need to join conformity with some other development plan beyond the London plan.
Yeah, so I agree with Inspector Normington that perhaps if we flag it at this stage as a potential modification and on the basis of what you've said, but I think certainly considering it in the round with the discussions we'll be having tomorrow as well, as Inspector Normington said, it'd help with that any potential knock-on effects of a modification that seeks to achieve those things. Okay, are there any other comments, Mr. Payne, at this stage?
No, thanks.
Mr. Furness? No, thanks. I see you've got your hand up, Mr. Potter. Would you like to come in?
That's correct. So thank you. Yes, just really picking up if the boroughs are going to be looking at the policies again. Just a question as to, with a view to flexibility, just a question, it's only a minor point, but in WP3, for example, it says the compensatory sites will be safeguarded for waste uses only. And I was just wondering whether the use of the term only was necessary in that context, that if there are uses that can take place on the site that don't compromise the capacity of the site for dealing with waste, then should that be something that will be prevented? I can give you a specific example here, a matter that we're actually dealing with outside of London, but could equally happen in London, a recycling site that has a rear yard, and to help sort of support them through the pandemic, etc., they actually installed a number of shipping containers in their rear yard, two levels. The ground level being used for storage of bales of materials from the recycling facility, but the top level actually being used for or available for storage generally. And so the actual footprint of land available for waste recycling isn't affected. The capacity of the site is not affected from the point of view of safeguarding, but there's again a bit of flexibility for possible use for something combined and mixed use rather than exclusively waste. So that particular example made me think about whether the inclusion of the term only was necessary and helpful in that context.
Thank you, Mr. Potter. Any views on that, Mr. James?
I think it's quite a specific case there that's been flagged up. We need to try and understand that some more and what the repercussions of that would be. But I think I wouldn't be inclined to propose that we remove the word only. specific cases arise like that, perhaps they could be dealt with as material considerations as opposed to having an in principle position in the plan. I mean, we can't account for every flexibility that may arise. So I would be inclined to keep it as it is at the moment and not propose a modification as suggested.
Do you think that the policy would lose any of its force if the word only was taken out?
I think potentially. I think the position is very clear within that policy. Again, I think my preference would be to keep it as it is, so that the principal position of the plan is clear, and if very specific circumstances come along, I mean, they could be considered. But I don't think by leaving the word only in there, I don't think that causes any issues personally.
Just one thing that perhaps just to think about, and I'm not suggesting, again, I'm trying not to put words into your mouth, but it's just something to think about that's perhaps a close analogy to Mr. Potter, is just thinking about the circular economy. And if obviously you've got waste processing, and from that you have a byproduct, and the byproduct might be better used if there was a facility close by or even on site that could use that byproduct and therefore fulfill the objectives of the circular economy. And it's me kind of saying, so what is wrong with that on a waste site if the capacity of that waste site wasn't at all affected by that opportunity, but it enables the circular economy aspects and aspirations to be delivered close at hand, and therefore meets all the proximity principles things, it meets sustainable transport issues. It seemed on face value quite sensible to do that. So would that policy negate those kind of opportunities as it's currently written? Or do those kind of opportunities need to be reflected in supporting text to explain how the circular economy might apply when there's a restrictive aspect of that policy that's currently written? So not, perhaps me not saying you need to think about it, not saying you need to change it, but I can see another side of the coin here, which is, well, how does that help deliver the circular economy, which is part and parcel of the London plan issues and part and parcel of your opening statement there. If there's an opportunity for intensification that actually doesn't take up employment land elsewhere, but there's an opportunity on site to locate that activity there, and everybody in that sense seems to win-win-win. There will undoubtedly a catch somewhere that you need to think about, but that's kind of my thinking. That I can see Mr. Potter's argument there, but I'm trying to bring it back to how they apply the circular economy, particularly in areas like London, where you've got a highly competitive land market.
I mean, we obviously have other policies in the plan that support the circular economy and those types of activities, particularly looking at WP7 and support for those activities that include, reuse, refurbishment, remanufactured products on site. So things of that nature could easily be accommodated without any conflict that would be consistent with that policy of the plan. I take your point that if there were other uses that did come forward that didn't undermine or prohibit any of the waste activities that are going on the site, that capacity could be maintained, and there were other benefits, then they could be supported. I mean, it would depend on the type of activities or uses that we're talking about, really. But I think in the first instance, we do, obviously there are policies that support the integration of circular economy activities on the site, and obviously, as I say, WP7 Part A specifically directs you towards those, but maybe there is a wider consideration about activities that would fall out of the waste use class. that could be accommodated on a site.
I think that there just seems to be a little bit of a tension. So on the one side of the coin, we're quite restrictive, waste only. The other side of the coin, yeah, we can accept some. So which policy takes the bulk of the weight here? So somewhere along the line, there needs to, I think there's a lack of some linkage between, on the one hand saying no, and the other side saying possibility. Because if we go to opportunity policy, I can't remember the number now, is it 7? That says, yeah, we could do, but then you get caught by the aspect of the one that says waste use only. So you can't have it kind of both ways, unless there's some explanation as to how these link, I think. And that's perhaps, I think, what Mr. Potter's alluding to there also in his comments. So I take your point. The plan doesn't necessarily restrict it, but if you read that policy, WP3, it perhaps does quite firmly. So how do you square that one?
Yes, thank you, sir. As I say, WP7 does say that waste development for intensification sites will involve that reuse, refurbishment, remanufacturing of products will be encouraged. So I think that is consistent with WP3. It's just a case of there are wider examples that would fall outside of that, which may cause an issue, which might need to then consider to try and see if we do need to address this tension that you're referring to.
I think it's WP3A is quite specific in saying that the site set out in South London Waste Plan will be safeguarded for waste uses or waste/mineral uses only. That's clear. There's no deviation from that as the policy is written. But then you move to WP7, and it says, "Oh, we might consider them. They would be okay." Well, some of those may be waste uses. There may not be waste uses, and that's where I think we get the tension of, well, if they're not waste uses, but nonetheless can use the waste product and contribute to the circular economy, then you come back to WP3A and it locks you out again. And it's, there's something not quite joined up in the way that you would apply those policies, I think is perhaps what this discussion has led us to, I think, this morning.
I think that's something for us to consider then, sir. And
Mr. Payne.
Thanks. It may come up in tomorrow's discussion, but if we're talking about the proposed mods to WP3, can I just flag the proposed modification about the removal of case-by-case basis text, which was a shame because that provided a bit of flexibility. But the insertion of at least meeting the equivalent of maximum achievable throughput of the site being lost, and then the reference to that, what that means is in the plan, page 43, which I think the boroughs referred to in their statement, which is the maximum throughput achieved by the site in any 1 year between 2013 and 2017. So that's the 5-year peak throughput which is being applied. Just raise the point that if it's applied to the letter 2013 to 2017, that kind of fixes it in aspect, and it should be the latest 5-year series of data that's applied rather than restricting it to those 5 years. Thanks.
Any response to those points, Mr. James?
I would agree, actually. We did update the reference to include the latest data range up to 2019, but obviously going forward, it would be the latest data, so it would be a rolling 5-year period effectively. I think we should reflect that. So we can propose a modification to address that.
And in terms of the modification, where case by case basis has been removed, now that's in response to the Mayor of London's correspondence. So could you just outline the rationale for that, please?
Yes, certainly. So the case by case basis wording originally was to reflect that in our experience of the last waste plan, it's not always possible for the maximum achievable throughput to be achieved on a site. That's why that wasn't us saying that we didn't want to go for that. We supported that as a base position, but there are some circumstances where it's not possible. So the case by case basis gave us some flexibility. The GLA's position on that was that they accepted that there may be some circumstances where that can't be achieved, but actually your base position should be the 5-year peak, and you can consider if there is a site that comes forward that can't achieve that, if there are very good reasons for that, then that could be dealt with as a material consideration. They thought we were doing it the wrong way round effectively. So we agreed to make that change, so we were in conformity with the London Plan's position on that point, and that's really why that change was offered up.
Right, so the case by case assessment is essentially will come into section 38.6 balance on a planning application then.
Yes. So as I say, there were some limited circumstances where we found that maximum wasn't possible. So we tried to reflect that this time around in the plan. But I think on reflection, it's correct to do it this way around. That our starting position is obviously consistent with the London Plan, and perhaps there are some unique circumstances where there's evidence that that's not achievable, and we could consider that at a planning application stage.
Okay, are there any other points on? Oh, Mr. Potter, you've got your hand up if you want to come in.
Thank you, sir. You're just really looking at the definitions that my colleague, Mr. Payne, referred us back to. On that case, is maximum throughput. I just noticed that in terms of type of facility, there's a definition there of 3 types: got a waste management facility, a waste transfer facility, and then a waste treatment facility, which is apparently a general term covering both waste management and waste transfer. I just did a quick word check for waste treatment facility. It doesn't actually seem to appear in the plan other than in that glossary, should we say. And I was just wondering, given that now the policies are proposed to expressly identify waste transfer facilities, by name, whether the inclusion of that particular type of facility adds anything to, in the glossary, actually adds anything to the understanding of the plan.
Thank you, Mr. Potter. And any reactions to that, Mr. James?
I wasn't clear on Mr. Potter was suggesting that we didn't need 2 separate glossary definitions for waste transfer and waste treatment. I didn't catch the first part of that. Was that the suggestion?
I think Mr. Potter was referring to page 43, the type of facility. So it's the introduction effectively to the site descriptions.
Yeah, sorry, I'm there now. Sorry, could you just repeat the first part of your questions? I'm at the page in question now, but I've lost the thread. Sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Potter, could you just clarify that comment, please?
Certainly, sir. Yes, it was just looking at the type of facility there, and it refers to three types: a waste management facility, a waste transfer facility, and then a waste treatment facility, which is supposed to a general term covering both waste management and waste transfer facilities. So I just happened to do a word check, and the term waste treatment facility doesn't seem to appear in the plan other than in that context. And given that now the proposal is to specifically refer to waste transfer facilities in the policies by way of those modifications, I was just wondering whether the retention of that additional definition of a waste treatment facility actually added anything to the understanding of the meaning or intention of the plan itself.
I mean, if this is the only place in which it occurs from the keyword search, then I mean, potentially that doesn't really add anything. If it's only appearing here and then in the glossary, I would like to have another look through the plan just to see if there's any other occurrences myself. But I mean, that's potentially something we can look at. It's probably quite a minor point, really.
I mean, if I take you to the C1 site, for example, in the site description, so that says type of facility, waste transfer station and treatment. So perhaps the word search didn't pick it up because it was it was part of, you know, a wider description there. Mr. Potter.
Sir, you're actually, you pick it up. Clearly, that wouldn't have been picked up in the word search I just did, but actually, what you've just pointed out there is an apparent contradiction, because apparently the term a waste treatment facility is supposed to capture both a waste management and a waste transfer facility, and yet in that description they've referred to it as a waste transfer and treatment facility. So that seems to sort of, your point there seems to highlight the potential confusion around the retention of that particular clause if you've got, you know, descriptions that straddle both types of capacity.
And in fact, looking at C5B, the type of facilities, household waste, amenity site. So that's not included, I think, in the type of facility description there. So I suppose there could be some looking to rationalize that just so that it reads logically across the descriptions. But if you could look at that, Mr. James.
Yes, there's some consistency checks to do there. We can make sure that there is a definitive position on that. It's not a problem.
Okay, if there's no more comments, that covers all the further questions that Inspector Normington and I have on this particular matter. So thank you for all your contributions this morning. We're going to adjourn now until, just looking at the timetable, 1:45. But I suggest that we progress to our discussion in matter 5 at that time. Okay, right. So the hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.